The letter that decided Elara's fate arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a dust-caked rider on a horse that looked half dead. It was a single sheet of fine, cream-colored paper, a stark contrast to the cracked, barren earth of her family's failed farm. The words were written in a firm, decisive hand, but the proposal they contained was one of desperation. Her father, a man whittled down to bone and regret by drought and debt, read it aloud, his voice raspy with disbelief and a flicker of shameful hope. The offer came from a Mr. Silas Blackwood, a name whispered in the nearby town of Redemption, with a mixture of pity and fear. He was the proprietor of the last oasis, the only ranch in the territory that had not bowed to the relentless sun or the even more relentless ambition of a land baron named Jedediah Cain. Silas Blackwood possessed the one thing every other man in the valley had lost: water, and with it life. But he had lost something in return. 5 years ago, a dynamite accident during a quarry blast had stolen his sight, leaving him a recluse on his own prosperous land. He was a ghost in his own home, a man with a kingdom he could not see. His proposal was brutally simple. He required a wife, not for companionship, the letter explicitly stated, nor for affection. He needed a pair of eyes, a woman to manage his household, to read his ledgers, to describe the state of his cattle and the color of the sky. In exchange, he offered his name, his protection, and a contract that would clear her family's staggering debts to Jedediah Cain, the very man who had bled them dry. It was a business transaction. She was to be a fixture, a tool, a seeing-eye wife. Her mother wept. Her father stared at his calloused, empty hands, but Elara, standing by the window and looking out at the withered corn stalks that represented her family's broken dreams, felt a strange and hollow calm, pity. That was the word that settled in her mind. She felt an overwhelming pity for this Silas Blackwood, a man so wealthy yet so broken he had to purchase a pair of eyes from a destitute family. She could do this. She could endure a passionless marriage out of pity. It was a cleaner emotion than the despair she was currently drowning in. "I will do it," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through her mother's sobs. "I will marry him." 2 weeks later, she stood on the porch of Silas Blackwood's ranch house. It was a fortress of dark timber and river stone, surrounded by a shocking expanse of green pasture that seemed to defy the pale, dusty landscape around it. A lone ranch hand, a wiry old man named Ben, had driven her from the town. He'd barely spoken 2 words the entire journey, his silence only adding to the mystique of the place. The front door opened before she could knock. The man who stood there was tall and broad-shouldered, his frame filling the doorway. His hair was as black as a starless night, his face a rugged collection of sharp angles and a square jaw. But his eyes were the color of a pale winter sky, milky and unfocused. They stared at a point somewhere over her shoulder, seeing nothing. He was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 30, but he carried himself with the heavy stillness of an old man. "Miss Elara," he said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble, like distant thunder. It held no warmth, no welcome. It was simply a statement of fact. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "Ben will show you to your room. We will discuss your duties in the morning." He turned and walked back into the shadows of the house, his left hand trailing along the wall, his movements deliberate and practiced. The pity she had felt before now returned with the force of a physical blow. It was one thing to imagine his affliction. It was another to witness it, to see such a powerful-looking man so utterly dependent on the geography of his own home. This would be her life now, guiding this broken king through his lightless kingdom. The first month was a study in silence and routine. Elara's room was in the opposite wing of the house from his. They were separated by a vast, quiet living space, filled with heavy oak furniture, unread books, and the faint scent of leather and dust. Her duties were just as the letter had described. She read to him from agricultural journals, described the health of the cattle as they rode the property line in a slow-moving wagon, and detailed the encroaching dust from the west. During these rides, she learned the true extent of his senses. He would often stop her mid-sentence, his head cocked. "A fence post is loose on the northern ridge," he'd say. "I can hear the wire vibrating in the wind." And he would be right. He could tell by the smell of the air when rain was coming, a day before the clouds even gathered. He knew every dip and rise of his land by the feel of the wagon wheels beneath him. His world was not one of sight, but of sounds, smells, and textures. He rarely spoke of his past, and never of the accident. He was a closed door, a locked room. Elara found herself talking more and more, filling the oppressive silence with descriptions of the world around them. She described the deep red of a sunset, the way the light caught in the manes of the horses, the subtle differences between the wildflowers growing by the creek. She did it out of duty, but a small part of her did it, because the emptiness in his pale eyes seemed to soak up all the light in the world, and she felt a desperate need to put some of it back. Her pity for him became the defining feature of their marriage. It was the foundation on which she built her days. She would cut his steak for him at dinner, ensure the paths in the house were always clear, and announce her presence when she entered a room so as not to startle him. He accepted these small kindnesses with a quiet, unreadable stoicism. He was her husband, her ward, her burden. It was in the second month that the first shadow of Jedediah Cain fell upon the last oasis. It began subtly, a section of fence cut in the dead of night, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off. Ben and the other two ranch hands spent a full day rounding them up. Silas merely stood on the porch, his face turned towards the north pasture, his expression grim. "It has begun," he said, to no one in particular. A week later, the water in one of the secondary wells turned brackish. Ben pulled up a bucket to find the bloated carcass of a coyote tossed within. It was a clear message, an act of spite. Elara felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. She remembered how Cain had operated with her family, a series of small, suffocating pressures, until they had no choice but to sell for pennies on the dollar. She read the town paper to Silas that evening, her voice trembling slightly. It spoke of Cain acquiring another parcel of land, his holdings now bordering Silas's property on 3 sides. "He wants this place," she whispered, putting the paper down. "He wants the water. You should consider his offer. Ben said he sent a man last month." Silas was sitting in his high-backed leather chair by the unlit fireplace, his hands resting on the carved wooden arms. "What do you smell, Elara?" he asked, his voice calm. She blinked, confused by the question. "I smell wood smoke and the leather of this chair." "I smell fear on you," he said, his tone flat. "It smells like ozone, like the air before a lightning strike, and I smell greed on the wind from the west. It smells of rust and decay. This land is not for sale." His calmness was infuriating. Did he not understand the danger? Did his blindness somehow shield him from the reality of what a man like Cain was capable of? Her pity soured into frustration. She was tethered to this man, this proud, foolish man who couldn't see the wolves circling his door. The violence escalated. One of the ranch hands was ambushed on his way back from town, left with a broken arm and a message scrawled in the dirt: "Sell." The hay barn was set alight, one moonless night, the flames casting dancing, monstrous shadows against the main house. They managed to save the horses, but the barn was a total loss. Elara stood beside Silas as they watched the embers glow against the night sky. The heat washed over her face, but she felt ice cold inside. She turned to him, her voice shaking with a mixture of terror and anger. "Why are you doing this, Silas? This is just pride. It's a barn today, but it will be us tomorrow. You cannot fight him. You cannot even see him." The words were cruel, and she regretted them the moment they left her lips. But they were born of a desperate fear she could no longer contain. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw a flicker of emotion on his face, a tightening of the jaw, a muscle twitching in his cheek. His pale eyes seemed to fix on her, and for a terrifying second, she felt as if he could see straight into her soul. "Go inside, Elara," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The air grows cold." He was treating her like a child. He was dismissing her, hiding in his darkness, while the world burned around them. Her pity was gone, burned away by the fire, leaving only the bitter ash of resentment. She had sacrificed her life for this man, and he would lead them both to ruin with his stubborn, sightless pride. She had married him out of pity, and now she felt she was married to a fool. The final confrontation came, as it always did with Jedediah Cain, at sundown. Elara saw them from the kitchen window, a congregation of riders cresting the western ridge, their forms stark silhouettes against the blood-red sky. There were 10 of them, led by a large, barrel-chested man she recognized as Cain himself. They moved not with the urgency of raiders, but with the lazy arrogance of undertakers who knew the coffin was already built. She ran to the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Silas, they're here. Cain is here with a whole band of men." Silas was where he always was, in his leather chair. He didn't move, he simply tilted his head, listening. 10 of them," he said. "It wasn't a question. I hear 10 horses. One of them is heavy, a draft mix. That would be Cain." Her blood ran cold. "How can you possibly?" "Their boots are kicking up shale on the north path. They mean to surround the house," he continued, his voice as placid as a frozen lake. He stood up, slowly, and turned his face towards the front door. "Elara, there is a storm cellar behind the kitchen. The door is thick oak. Go there now. Do not open it until the sun is fully risen tomorrow. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." She stared at him, aghast. "And what about you? You can't be serious. They will kill you." "Go, Elara," he commanded, his voice hardening. "No." The word burst out of her. "I will not hide in a hole while they murder you. I married you, Mr. Blackwood. I will not be a coward." She looked around wildly, her eyes landing on an old hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace. It was her father's, but she knew how to use it. Silas was silent for a long moment. A strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. It might have been regret, or perhaps something else entirely. "Very well," he said softly. He walked to the fireplace, his movements no longer hesitant. There was a new economy to them, a fluid grace she had never seen before. His hands didn't grope for the mantle. They went directly to it, lifting down not the rifle, but a matched pair of Colt Walker revolvers from their holsters, heavy and dark. He checked them with his thumbs, the clicks of the cylinders echoing in the tense silence. His movements were precise, efficient, and terrifyingly fast. He didn't fumble, he didn't hesitate. He handled the weapons as if they were extensions of his own hands. Elara's breath hitched in her throat. Something was wrong. Terribly, impossibly wrong. "Silas," she whispered. He turned his head in her direction, and the full, chilling weight of his pale, sightless eyes fell upon her. The pity she had felt for him, the frustration, the resentment, it all evaporated, replaced by a sudden primal fear that was sharper than any blade. The man before her was not the helpless ward she had been tending for months. He was a stranger. "The cellar would have been for your own safety, Elara," he said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "Not for mine." A heavy boot kicked the front door, the wood groaning in protest. "Blackwood, we know you're in there. Come on out and sign the deed, or we'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." It was Cain's voice, thick with smug certainty. Silas moved towards the center of the room, away from the windows. He held a Colt in each hand, resting them loosely at his sides. "Stay behind the stone hearth," he ordered her, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And cover your ears." Elara scrambled behind the massive fireplace, her mind reeling. This was impossible. A blind man with 2 guns against 10 armed men? It was suicide. It was madness. The front door splintered, crashing inwards. 3 men poured into the room, fanning out, their guns raised. The fading light from the doorway cast them in long, distorted shadows. "Well, well," the first one sneered. "Look what we got here. The blind fool thinks he's a gunman." What happened next would be seared into Elara's memory for the rest of her days. Silas did not move. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening to a faint melody. The first man took a step forward, his boots scuffing on the wooden floor. The sound was his death warrant. The Colt in Silas's right hand barked, a deafening roar of fire and thunder in the enclosed space. The man who had sneered was thrown backwards, a neat, dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He was dead before he hit the floor. The other 2 men, stunned for a fraction of a second, opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the room in strobing, hellish bursts. Plaster exploded from the walls. A mirror shattered, but Silas was no longer where he had been. He had dropped, spun, and fired twice more in a single fluid motion. The reports of his Colts were so close together they sounded like one. The 2 gunmen crumpled to the ground, their own shots going wild. It had taken less than 3 seconds. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the ringing in Elara's ears. She peeked from behind the hearth, her eyes wide with disbelief. 3 bodies lay on the floor, and Silas stood in the center of it all, a calm, still point in a storm of his own making. Wisps of smoke curled from the barrels of his guns. 3 down, Silas said, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. He brought hired guns, they're sloppy. From outside, Cain's voice roared, laced now with shock and fury. What in God's name? Open fire! Kill him! The windows on either side of the room exploded inwards in a shower of glass as bullets ripped through the house. Elara screamed, pressing herself against the stone. Silas didn't even flinch. He seemed to know where every bullet would go. He moved into the deep shadows near the hallway, becoming one with the darkness. A man tried to climb through the shattered window frame, his gun leading the way. Before his feet touched the floor, Silas fired. The man fell back out of the window with a choked cry. Another gunman, emboldened, charged through the broken doorway. Silas was waiting. He didn't aim at the man. He aimed at a heavy iron skillet hanging by the hearth. The bullet struck the iron with a loud clang, ricocheting sideways with a sickening thud into the gunman's throat. The man collapsed, gurgling, clutching his neck. Elara watched, mesmerized by the sheer, terrifying artistry of it all. He was using the house itself as a weapon. He knew every angle, every surface. He was a phantom in his own home, a force of nature. His blindness was not a weakness, it was his greatest strength. He wasn't distracted by the flashes of gunfire, the flying debris. He was focused on the one thing that mattered: sound, the crunch of a boot on glass, the cocking of a hammer, the sharp intake of a breath. Before a man made his move, he could hear death coming. 2 more men tried to rush him from the hallway. He fired 2 shots without even looking in their direction. His guns aimed at 2 different points down the dark corridor. 2 heavy thuds answered him. Elara began to understand. He hadn't been practicing his dependency on her, he had been studying. Every day they had walked the house. Every time she had described the placement of a new piece of furniture, he had been mapping it, building a 3-dimensional image of his world in his mind. He knew this house better than any sighted man ever could. Only Cain and 2 of his men were left now, hiding outside, their confidence shattered. "It's a trick," Cain yelled, his voice tight with panic. "He ain't blind. He's been fooling us all." Silas let out a low, humorless chuckle. "They always say that," he whispered, reloading his Colts with a speed that defied belief. He pulled fresh cartridges from his belt, ejecting the spent shells, his fingers moving with practiced mechanical precision. He then did something that made Elara's blood freeze. He walked over to the large oil lamp on the main table, turned up the wick until it burned brightly, and then threw it against the far wall. The glass shattered, and flames erupted, spreading quickly up the dry timber walls. "What are you doing?" she cried. "Smoking them out," Silas replied, his face illuminated by the growing fire. The flickering light cast dancing shadows that made his pale eyes seem to glow with an inner fire. He stood by the main doorway, framed by the inferno behind him, a dark, avenging angel. The remaining 2 gunmen, terrified of being trapped in the blaze, broke cover and ran from the side of the house, firing wildly toward the door. It was a fatal mistake. Silas met them with a final, terrifying volley. 2 shots, 2 more bodies falling into the dirt of the yard. Now only Cain was left. The land baron was crouched behind the water trough, his pistol shaking in his hand. Silas stepped out onto the porch, the burning house at his back. He stood tall, his revolvers hanging at his sides. "It's just you and me now, Jedediah," Silas called out, his voice rolling across the yard. "You came to take my land. Come and get it." Cain, his face pale with sweat and fear in the firelight, raised his pistol and fired. The shot went wide. He fired again and again. Silas didn't even move. He just stood there, listening to the bullets whistle past him in the night. He was counting. When Cain's gun clicked empty, Silas spoke again, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "My turn." He raised his right-hand Colt, took a single step forward, and fired. The shot echoed across the valley. Jedediah Cain stood frozen for a second, a look of utter surprise on his face, before he slowly toppled forward into the dust, a dark stain spreading across his back. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the crackle of the fire consuming the house behind him. 10 men, 10 dead men, scattered around his yard like fallen leaves. And in the center of it all stood Silas Blackwood, the blind rancher, the man she had married out of pity. Elara slowly, shakily, rose from behind the hearth. The heat from the fire was intense. She walked through the splintered doorway and onto the porch, her eyes fixed on her husband. He hadn't moved. He stood with his back to her, a statue carved from shadow and fury. "Silas?" Her voice was a fragile whisper. He holstered his pistols and turned to her. The firelight danced in his milky, unseeing eyes. The stranger was gone, and in his place was the quiet, stoic man she knew, but he was forever changed in her perception. He was no longer a broken king, he was a dragon, and this ranch was his horde. "The house is lost," he said, his voice laced with something that might have been sorrow. "But the land is safe." "Who? What are you?" she asked, the question she should have asked months ago. He was silent for a long time, the roar of the fire filling the space between them. "A long time ago," he began, his voice low, "I had a different name. Men called me Silas the Shadow. I wasn't a rancher, I was a gun for hire. The best there was. I took a job protecting a payroll wagon. We were ambushed. Dynamite. I was the only survivor. It took my sight, but it gave me a chance to escape that life. I came here, bought this land, and buried the shadow for good." "You're not blind," she breathed, though she knew it wasn't true. She had seen the emptiness in his eyes. "My eyes are dead, Elara. That is the truth. But a man can learn to see in other ways. I faked the helplessness because I wanted peace. I wanted the world to believe I was a harmless cripple, to leave me be. But men like Cain, they see any perceived weakness as an invitation." He took a hesitant step towards her. "I chose you as my wife for a reason. I turned away dozens of other women. When your father brought you to town, I overheard you arguing with him. You spoke of dignity, of fighting for what was yours, even when all was lost. I didn't hear pity in your voice. I heard steel. I knew you wouldn't break. I needed a partner with a spine, not just a pair of eyes." It all crashed down on her at once. The months of silence, his cryptic warnings, his unnerving calm. It wasn't pride or foolishness, it was confidence, it was control. He hadn't been ignoring the threat, he had been waiting for it, preparing for it, in his own way. She looked from his face to the carnage in the yard, then back again. The pity she had carried for so long felt like a child's foolish notion. It was replaced by a wave of emotions so powerful they left her breathless, awe, terror, and a profound, reluctant respect that bordered on admiration. He had married her for her strength, and she had married him out of pity for a weakness that had never existed. The roof of the ranch house groaned and collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky. They stood there, bathed in the destructive light, the old life burning away to reveal something new and uncertain. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Now," Silas said, turning his face to the vast, dark expanse of the land they had just defended. "We rebuild, together." He reached out his hand, not to find his way, but as an invitation. Elara looked at the calloused palm, the hand that had just dealt death with such terrifying precision. She thought of the helpless man she had agreed to marry, and the lethal protector he had turned out to be. They were one and the same. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, and for the first time, warm. The marriage that had been born of pity was now reforged in fire and blood. It was no longer a contract, it was a partnership. And as she stood beside him, the sole witness to his terrible secret power, Elara knew one thing with absolute certainty. No one would ever threaten the last oasis again,